The first thing Master Sergeant Cole Hadrian noticed about the crash site was that it smelled like rain on hot iron, a clean, almost apologetic smell for something that had come down hard enough to leave a gouge 200 meters long in the red Georgia clay. He'd been called out on the radio at 0340, roused from 4 hours of stolen sleep in the duty room of Forward Operating Base Calder, a converted grain processing facility somewhere in the rolling farmland southwest of what used to be Savannah. The base was a patchwork of corrugated walls, sandbag revetments, and improvised antenna arrays, held together mostly by habit and the stubbornness of the 640 personnel who lived and worked inside it. Hadrian had been stationed here for 11 months. He knew the smell of every corridor, the groan of every generator, the particular silence that fell over the motor pool at 0200 when even the mechanics had given up for the night. He did not know the smell of an alien spacecraft, but he was learning. The gouge ran northeast to southwest through a stand of longleaf pines that had been growing undisturbed since before his grandfather was born. They were down now, snapped at the base, root balls the size of small houses still trailing clumped red earth into the night air. At the end of the gouge sat what looked, from a distance, like a crumpled silver fish. Up close it was stranger, surfaces that curved in directions that didn't quite correspond to any geometry Hadrian had studied, a hull material that caught his flashlight beam and returned it at angles that made his eyes water. Not reflective exactly. More like the object was disagreeing with the light hitting it on philosophical grounds. "What are we looking at?" said Corporal Iseult Marine, stepping up beside him. She was 23 and managed to look approximately 40 in the pre-dawn dark, which Hadrian had come to recognize as her operational face, a kind of compressed intensity she wore, the way other people wore body armor. "Don't know," Hadrian said. "Is it one of ours?" He looked at her. "Right," she said. They'd been at war with the Veresi for 4 years. Not a metaphorical war, not a proxy conflict, not a police action with escalating rules of engagement. A war. The Veresi had arrived in a fleet of 17 warships that materialized in low Earth orbit on a Tuesday morning in early March, and within 6 hours they had demonstrated the capacity to crack open hardened bunkers from orbit, disrupt GPS and satellite communications across entire hemispheres, and render most air-breathing propulsion systems temporarily inoperative within a 50-kilometer radius of their dropships. They were not, as far as anyone could determine, interested in negotiation. They deployed ground forces in autonomous units called spears, six-limbed, heavily armored creatures that moved in coordinated swarms and appeared to communicate via subsonic pulses that the human ear registered only as a vague pressure behind the teeth. They were methodical, they were patient, and they had, over 4 years of grinding attritional warfare, reduced the combined military capacity of every armed nation on Earth by approximately 60%. What they had not done, and what continued to baffle every intelligence analyst Hadrian had ever spoken to, was finish it. 17 warships in orbit, with demonstrated ability to sterilize urban centers from range, and they hadn't done it. They pushed. They seized. They extracted something. Geological surveys suggested massive deep-core drilling operations wherever they held ground for more than 3 months. And then occasionally they contracted, pulling spears back from held positions for no discernible tactical reason, as though the war was proceeding according to a schedule that had nothing to do with winning or losing in any human sense of those words. Hadrian had stopped trying to understand the why a long time ago. He focused on the what. Right now, the what was a wrecked spacecraft in a Georgia pine forest and the faint possibility that it had survivors. "I'm going in," he said. "Sergeant," Marine said, and her tone had that particular flatness that meant she was about to say something he wasn't going to enjoy hearing. "Command's going to want to. Command's 40 minutes away. If there's someone alive in there, the clock is running." He unslung his rifle, not because he expected to need it inside, but because standing in front of an alien crash site with his hands empty felt like exactly the kind of optimism that got people killed. "Stay out here. If the hull starts doing anything weird, yell. Define weird. You'll know it when you see it." He found the entry point at the aft end of the hull, where the impact had peeled back a seam in the fuselage like a partially opened tin. The smell was stronger here, that rain-on-iron quality mixed with something sweeter, almost medicinal. He clicked on his helmet lamp and ducked inside. The interior of the craft was smaller than he'd expected, roughly the size of a city bus, though the interior geometry was no more cooperative than the exterior. Surfaces met at strange angles. What might have been seats or restraint systems were arranged in a cluster near the center of the compartment, elongated forms that suggested the Veresi body plan, without quite matching what Hadrian had seen of spear units. Longer, more delicate, built for something other than ground combat. Two of the forms were visibly damaged, crushed by the impact, and the third was moving. Hadrian had his rifle up before the thought was fully formed. Old habit. 4 years of old habits. Then he lowered it, because the thing that was moving was small, smaller than anything the Veresi deployed in combat, smaller than any piece of hardware he'd ever seen them use, and it was clearly hurt, and it was looking at him with two eyes that were, despite everything, despite the faint bioluminescence and the vertical pupils and the too wide placement, unmistakably frightened. It was the size of a human child, maybe 10 years old in human terms, though he had no framework for Veresi developmental biology whatsoever. Its skin was a pale blue-gray that seemed to shift faintly in the lamplight, and it was wearing what appeared to be a flight suit several sizes too large. One arm pinned under a collapsed structural member. Around its neck, on a braided cord, hung a device that looked like nothing so much as a rounded cube of smoky glass, about the size of a large fist, that pulsed with a dim interior light every few seconds. It said something. The sound was subsonic at the low end, and had harmonics in the upper range that made the fillings in Hadrian's back teeth vibrate. Not the aggressive tactical pulse of a spear. Something that, in the context of the expression on the creature's face and the specific awkwardness of its trapped arm, sounded very much like it might translate to "help me." "Okay," Hadrian said, mostly to himself, and slung his rifle across his back. It took him 4 minutes to shift the collapsed structural member enough to free the arm. The creature, he needed to stop thinking of it as the creature. The word felt wrong in his head, too impersonal for something that watched him work with that mix of pain and cautious hope on its face. The child he amended didn't fight him or flinch away. It held still, made small adjustments when he indicated with hand signals, and when the arm came free, it looked at him with an expression that he recognized from 17 years of soldiering, from every frightened kid in every shelled village he'd ever walked through. Pure, uncomplicated relief. "Can you walk?" he said. It looked at him. The vertical pupils tracked his face. "Walk." He mimed it. 2 fingers walking across his palm, it watched. Then it pointed at its left leg and made a sound that was unmistakably a negative. "Okay," he said. "Okay, arms up." He carried it out of the wreck on his back, the way he'd carry a child. The device on its cord pressed warm between them, pulsing every few seconds like a slow heartbeat. Marine was outside with her rifle raised by the time he cleared the hull opening. She held it for a moment, professional reflex, he didn't blame her, and then lowered it slowly. "Sergeant," she said. "Don't," he said. "I wasn't going to. Whatever you were going to say, don't." He set the child carefully on the ground at the base of a felled pine, checking the leg, visibly swollen, possibly fractured, a bad bruise darkening across the joint. "Get the trauma kit from the Humvee. You want me to. Medical kit, Marine. Now." She went. He crouched in front of the child and looked at it in the pre-dawn dark. It looked back. The device on its cord glowed its slow pulse. Somewhere far off to the east, the sky was beginning to lighten. "My name is Hadrian," he said. "Cole Hadrian." The child tilted its head. It made a sound careful, deliberate, experimental. That was clearly an attempt at the sounds he'd just made. What came out was approximately Cole Harian. "Close enough," he said. It pointed at itself with one slender finger, made a sequence of sounds that his auditory system genuinely could not parse as discrete phonemes. He shook his head. It tried again, shorter. 3 syllables that he could approximately render as Elvian. "Elvian," he said. The bioluminescence in its skin shifted slightly. He would come, over the following days, to recognize that shift, a brightening in the cheek and forehead regions, as the equivalent of a smile. Marine came back with the kit. She crouched beside him and began working on the leg with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd patched up worse than a swollen joint in considerably worse circumstances. The child watched her with enormous vertical pupilled eyes. At one point, without any evident deliberation, it reached out and placed one hand very gently on Marine's forearm, as though checking whether she was real. Marine, who Hadrian had seen keep her hands steady while suturing a wound under incoming fire, stopped for just a moment. Then she looked at the child and said, in a voice approximately 2 registers softer than her operational voice, "It's okay. We're okay." They were approximately 40 minutes away from being neither of those things. The radio call came in at 0530. Captain Gregor Vance, USAF's Special Technical Exploitation Unit, was 2 hours out and would arrive at Phobe Calder at approximately 0700. He requested that all materials and any survivors from the crash site be secured and held for transport. He used the word materials twice and the word survivors once. Hadrian noted the order in which those words had appeared. He knew Vance by reputation. Most people in the field did. The Special Technical Exploitation Unit had been stood up 18 months ago under direct DIA authority, tasked with capturing, securing, and exploiting any Varesi technology or personnel that could be taken intact. They had done extraordinary work by some measures. The intel derived from 3 captured spear units and several tons of salvage hardware had contributed significantly to the development of the Thornton Barrier, a directed electromagnetic system that could temporarily disrupt the Varesi's coordination pulses and buy infantry units precious minutes of disorganized enemy fire. That was undeniably valuable. The less official record of the Stu, the things that circulated in mess halls and duty rooms, and late-night conversations between people who'd been in the field long enough to hear things, was less clean. Interrogation techniques that occupied a legally ambiguous space. Equipment returned from Stu custody that functioned differently than when it left. Not broken, exactly, more like partially understood. Stripped of components that hadn't been fully cataloged before removal. And a specific incident in the second year of the war, in a facility outside Colorado Springs, that Hadrian had never gotten a complete account of, but that had produced a very particular kind of silence in the people who mentioned it. He sat in the duty room with LVN at 0545, watching the child try to understand a cup of water, not drink it, understand it. LVN had picked up the cup, sniffed it, touched the surface tension with one fingertip, watched the ripple, then held the cup up against the window and examined the way the early light passed through it with an expression of such genuine, uncomplicated scientific fascination that Hadrian had found himself leaning forward too, as though he'd forgotten he already knew what water was. The device on its cord was sitting on the table between them. LVN had set it down after Hadrian had made cautious eye contact and indicated the table surface with a questioning expression. Some kind of trust gesture, he thought, or an opening. The device pulsed its slow glow. "What is that?" he asked, nodding at it. LVN set down the water cup and looked at the device. Then it picked it up and held it toward him, palm up. Hadrian reached out and took it. The first thing he noticed was that it was warm, approximately the temperature of a living body. The second thing was that it was heavier than it looked, with a density that suggested the smoky glass surface was not glass at all, but something considerably more complex. The third thing, and the thing that went straight from his fingertips to somewhere behind his sternums and stayed there, was that when he held it, the pulse changed. It had been beating every 4 or 5 seconds. In his hands, it was beating approximately twice a second, and the interior light was moving, not just pulsing but forming shapes, dissolving, reforming. Like a thought process, he was somehow being invited to observe. "Okay," he said carefully, and set it back on the table. LVN watched him with those 2 wide eyes. The bioluminescence in its cheeks had brightened. "What does it do?" It made a sequence of sounds. Then, apparently recognizing that he hadn't understood, it reached out and took the device in both hands, held it for a moment, and directed it at the overhead fluorescent light fixture. The fixture, which had been buzzing with its characteristic 40-watt complaint for the full 11 months Hadrian had been stationed here, stopped buzzing. The light became cleaner, steadier, several degrees warmer in its color spectrum, as though the device had reached up and diagnosed whatever was wrong with the ballast and fixed it from across the room. Then LVN pointed it at Hadrian's rifle against the wall. "Don't," he said. It lowered the device, looked at him. "Not that," he said, "okay?" He held up a hand, palm out. Whatever that gesture meant to a Varesi child, it seemed to read as sufficiently cautionary. LVN nodded, a human gesture, Hadrian realized, picked up from watching him, and set the device back on the table. They looked at each other across the table as the sky outside went from gray to pale gold. "Your ship went down," Hadrian said. "There were 2 others on it." LVN went very still. "I'm sorry," he said. He didn't know if the words meant anything. He said them anyway. The bioluminescence in the child's skin dimmed. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. It sat very quietly for a moment, the device cradled in both hands, and made a sound that was low and repetitive, and needed no translation at all. Hadrian sat with it. He didn't say anything else. He'd learned, a long time ago, that sometimes the only useful thing you could do for someone in that particular moment was be present, not fill the silence. Just be a body in the room that meant they weren't alone in it. Outside, the base was waking up. He could hear the generators cycling up to full load, the clatter of the mess hall, the distant bark of a sergeant running morning PT, normal sounds. 11 months of normal sounds. He was suddenly acutely aware of how much he had come to rely on those sounds. At 0640, Marine knocked on the duty room door and opened it 3 inches. "Sergeant," she said, "you should see this." He looked at her face. She had her operational expression on. Command frequency? Command frequency. He looked at Elvian. He held up one finger. Stay here, right here. He pointed at the chair. Elvian looked at the finger, at the chair, at him, and then performed the very deliberate act of sitting back in the chair with both hands in its lap. Clear enough. He followed Marine to the communications room. The message was text only, routed through 2 layers of authentication he'd never seen used for a routine-based communication. It was from the DIA Joint Exploitation Coordinator, Office of Captain Gregor Vance. It confirmed arrival at 0700 Row. It listed specific instructions for the security and isolation of any survivor or artifact recovered from the crash site. It used the word asset. It used the phrase minimum personnel exposure. It specified that no recording devices of any kind were to be active in the presence of the survivor. He wants us to turn off the cameras, Marine said. I read it before he gets here. I read it. She was quiet for a moment. Then what are we going to do? Hadrian looked at the message for a long time. He was thinking about the order of words again. Materials first, survivors second, and now assets. And no cameras. We're going to do our jobs, he said. Which part of our jobs? He looked at her. She met it without flinching. The part, he said slowly, where we don't let people in our custody get hurt. She nodded. Not agreement, exactly. More like the confirmation of something she'd already decided. Vance arrived at 0703. He came in 2 Blackhawks and a convoy of 4 vehicles, which was more personnel and equipment than Hadrian had been told to expect. The stew operated lean by doctrine. This was not lean. This was a reaction force. Hadrian was standing outside the gate when the vehicles rolled in. He was in his duty uniform, rifle on his back, coffee in one hand, doing his absolute best to look like a man who had had an unremarkable morning. Vance stepped out of the lead vehicle, and Hadrian got his first real look at the man. He was tall, perhaps 45, with a kind of face that had been constructed for authority, angular jaw, pale eyes that moved with systematic efficiency, the bearing of someone who had never once in his adult life been told no and had it stick. He wore no unit insignia that Hadrian recognized. His uniform was impeccable in the specific way that meant he had not been in the field recently. Sergeant Hadrian, he said. Not a question. Captain. Hadrian didn't salute. Vance noticed. He filed it. The survivor. Where is it? Hadrian said. Vance's eyes went flat. Excuse me? The survivor goes by he, in my experience of him over the last several hours. Hadrian took a sip of his coffee. That's my assessment. You may assess differently. Vance looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked past him at the base. I'll need the crash site coordinates, all personnel who were at the scene, and access to the subject immediately. Subject's in the medical bay, Hadrian said. Corporal Marine is with him. Broken bone in the leg, we think. We've been treating it as best we can. He paused. He's a kid, Captain, whatever the species. That's a determination we'll make at the facility. The facility, Hadrian repeated. Where's the facility? That's not information you need, Sergeant. Hadrian smiled. It was the particular smile that 11 years of military service had given him. Polite, patient, and about as warm as a February rifle barrel. Right, well, I'll take you to the medical bay. He walked Vance and 2 of his people through the base. He noted the body language of Vance's team, the way they held their hands, the angles at which they positioned themselves relative to doorways, the specific type of alert attention that wasn't security awareness, but was something trained for more targeted purposes. He had seen people hold themselves like that before, in interrogation facilities, in containment scenarios. The medical bay was a converted administrative office with 4 cots, a field surgical kit, and a portable diagnostic scanner that was 2 generations out of date, but kept working because their medic, Sergeant First Class Ortega, refused to let it die. Ortega was standing at the door when they arrived. Marine was inside, sitting beside the cot where Elvian lay propped on 2 pillows, leg immobilized in a field splint, the device on its cord resting on the blanket within reach of one hand. Elvian looked up when Hadrian entered. The bioluminescence shifted. Recognition, something like relief. Then it saw Vance and the team behind him, and the light dimmed, and it went very still. Hadrian had seen that stillness in animals, prey animals specifically, in the moment before they decided whether to bolt or freeze. This is Captain Vance, Hadrian said to Elvian. He kept his voice level. He's here to talk to you. He looked at Elvian steadily and said very clearly, I'm not going anywhere. Elvian looked at him. Then it looked at Vance, then back at Hadrian, and its expression. Reading cross-species facial expressions was still something Hadrian was assembling an intuition for, but he was getting there, was a very specific kind of asking. The kind of question a child asks when it wants confirmation that the thing it's afraid of isn't as bad as it looks. He didn't lie to it. He kept his face neutral and stood his ground 3 feet from the cot. Vance crouched in front of Elvian and looked at the device. His expression didn't change, his eyes did. "I need that," he said. He reached out. Elvian's hand closed over the device before Vance's fingers were within a foot of it. Vance looked at Hadrian. "He's got a broken leg and he's been awake since before dawn," Hadrian said. "Maybe give him a minute." "Sergeant, this is a direct." "A minute, Captain." He said it the way a wall says stop. The room was very quiet. Outside, through the one small window, he could hear the generators and the distant sounds of the base. Someone in the motor pool was running an angle grinder. The sound carried. Vance stood up. He looked at Hadrian with those pale, systematic eyes, and Hadrian looked back, and the thing that happened between them in that moment was not the thing that Vance had expected to happen. He had expected to look at a sergeant and see a sergeant. What he found instead was something more like a locked door. "Outside," Vance said. They went outside. The conversation lasted 9 minutes. Hadrian remembered most of it in fragments afterward. The legal framework that Vance laid, out with rehearsed precision, the several references to National Security Authority, the single implied mention of a court-martial that Vance introduced and withdrew in the same breath when Hadrian's expression did not change. He remembered thinking, at some point near the middle of it, that Vance was not actually cruel. He was something more complicated, and in some ways more dangerous than cruel. He was a man who had constructed a complete moral framework in which what he intended to do to Elvian was correct and necessary, and that framework was well built and internally consistent, and arguing with it was like arguing with architecture. So Hadrian didn't argue with it. "You're right that I don't have authority to prevent this transfer," he said. "He's technically an enemy combatant, under the OMF language, and the stew has explicit mandate. I got all that." He looked out across the yard. "I'm asking you, personally, one soldier to another, to let me spend the morning with him first. Walk him through what's happening. He's scared and he's hurt and he's a kid. Whatever the hell kind of kid. And if you take him out of here like baggage, he's going to fight every inch of the way. And you're going to end up with a damaged subject and no cooperation. Give me the morning." Vance looked at him. For the first time since arriving, his expression showed something other than systematic purpose. Something uncertain. "You'll hand him over at 1400, he said finally. "Voluntarily." 1400, Hadrian agreed. He walked back into the medical bay. Marine looked at him. He shook his head slightly. Her jaw tightened. She looked away. He sat down beside Elvian's cot. The child watched him. "You've got about 6 hours, he said quietly. "And I've got some things to show you." He started with the radio. There was a battered shortwave unit in the duty room that someone had installed in the pre-war years, and that persisted in the base's unofficial life because it could pick up commercial broadcasts from 3 states over when the ionosphere cooperated. At 0830, it was pulling in a classical station out of Atlanta, something orchestral, a piece Hadrian didn't know, but that filled the duty room with a warmth that the fluorescent light, now fixed, steady, perfect, made somehow more evident. Elvian heard it and went completely still, not the stillness of fear, a different stillness, the stillness of something paying absolute attention. "Music," Hadrian said. Elvian made a questioning sound. Its eyes hadn't left the radio. "We make sounds. Organized sounds. Sounds that don't carry information except..." He stopped. He was not good at this kind of explanation. He was good at terrain, logistics, threat assessment, small unit tactics, the specific calculus of keeping people alive in bad situations. He was not good at explaining what music was. He wasn't sure anyone was. "It's how we feel things out loud," he finally said, "when the words don't fit." Elvian listened to the music for 3 straight minutes without moving. Then it looked at him, and the bioluminescence in its skin was doing something he hadn't seen before. A complex, rippling pattern across the cheekbones and forehead, multiple frequencies of light, pulsing in something that felt, though he couldn't have articulated why, like a response. As though it was trying to do what the orchestra was doing. As though it had understood the project immediately and was attempting to participate. "Yeah," he said softly, "that." Marin appeared in the doorway. She was holding 2 mess hall trays. "I don't know what he eats," she said. "Neither do I. Bring something from every category." She came back with a tray that was a survey of what Fob Calder had available at 0900. Scrambled eggs, a bread roll, some kind of fruit compote from a tin, 2 crackers, a small cup of peanut butter, and a triangle of processed cheese. She set it in front of Elvian with the careful neutrality of someone presenting options without pressure. Elvian examined each item with the same thorough attention it had given the glass of water. It sniffed the eggs. It touched the bread roll and felt the texture of the crust. It held up the triangle of processed cheese, examined it against the light, and looked at Hadrian with an expression that was unmistakably skeptical. Yeah, Hadrian said, I know. It tried the peanut butter, reacted to the texture with an expression that cycled rapidly through surprise, confusion, and something that landed on cautious approval. It ate about half the cup. It did not touch the processed cheese again. Ortega came by at 0930 to check the leg. He moved around LVN with the unhurried competence of a medic who had treated everything from blast trauma to snake bite, and had long since stopped, being surprised by the specifics of anatomy. He checked the splint, assessed the swelling, reduced, which was something, and produced a pair of improvised crutches, cut down to LVN's height from a spare pair of standard issue. He handed them to LVN with a brief, businesslike nod. LVN took them, tried standing, nearly went down, caught itself, tried again, found the balance, took 2 careful steps. Ortega watched and said, not bad, which was the closest thing to effusive praise his vocabulary appeared to contain. By 1000, LVN was moving slowly through the base, balanced on the crutches, looking at everything. Hadrian walked with him. He showed him the generators. LVN spent 10 minutes examining the diesel units with an expression of such bow fascination that Hadrian found himself trying to explain the internal combustion engine, which was a project he was not architecturally suited for. He showed him the mess hall, where the morning shift had been replaced by the lunch prep crew, and where Private Vasquez, 19 years old and from a small town in New Mexico, was sitting at a corner table writing a letter by hand. LVN stopped and watched Vasquez write for a long time. Hadrian watched LVN. Letters, he said eventually. We write things down. So the person we want to talk to can read them later. Even if he paused. Even if we can't be there. LVN's eyes tracked the movements of Vasquez's pen. The bioluminescent pattern was doing the complex ripple again. After a moment, it turned to Hadrian and made a sound that was quiet and interrogative. I don't know if your people do that, Hadrian said. I don't know much about your people at all. LVN looked at him steadily, then it pointed at itself, then at him. Then it made a gesture that was clearly meant as an equalizing one. Both hands level, a small balancing motion. You and me. Yeah, Hadrian said. You and me. At 10:45, they ended up in the motor pool. Hadrian had been steering gently toward the eastern perimeter, thinking that if he could get LVN to the tree line before 1400 with enough of a head start, and if Marine had managed to arrange what he'd quietly asked her to arrange, but LVN had stopped at the motor pool, looking at the Humvees and trucks with that systematic scientific attention, and then it had taken the device from its cord and done something with it that Hadrian had not been prepared for. The device produced a light, not the internal pulse, but a projected beam, narrow and intensely focused, that hit the engine block of the nearest Humvee and held there for about 4 seconds. Then LVN lowered it and looked at Hadrian and made a specific sound that he had come to recognize as a question. It's a vehicle, Hadrian said. We use them to move people and equipment. He paused. Can you fix it with that thing? LVN tilted its head. Because that one has a persistent hydraulic leak that's been driving my mechanics insane for 3 months. LVN looked at the Humvee. It pointed the device at the undercarriage, held it there for perhaps 30 seconds, and then lowered it again. Corporal Tanaka, who was under the adjacent vehicle doing something with a socket wrench, pulled herself out and looked at the Humvee's undercarriage. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the hell? Fixed? Hadrian said. There's no leak, Tanaka said. She sounded the way people sound when reality has gently declined to behave as expected. How is there no leak? I just checked it yesterday. LVN watched this exchange with its head tilted, the bioluminescence doing a slow, warm pulse. Then it looked at Hadrian, and the expression on its face was something like professional satisfaction. That's what it does, Hadrian said quietly. It fixes things. He looked at the device, he looked at LVN. He thought about 17 warships in orbit. He thought about 60% attrition. He thought about the Thornton barrier, and the 3 captured spear units, and the missing components from equipment returned by the stew, and he thought about a facility outside Colorado Springs and a very particular kind of silence. He thought about what a device that could repair anything might mean in the hands of people who were very good at understanding what things were worth and very deliberately not asking what they might cost. Can it? He started and stopped. LVN looked at him. Can it do more than fix things? LVN held the device in both hands. It looked at it for a moment. Then it looked at Hadrian with an expression that was very old for a face that young, and it made a sound that was low and careful, and he thought honest. He didn't understand the words. He understood the tone. Okay, he said. Okay, come with me. At 11:30, Hadrian sat LVN down in the duty room, shut the door, and told him the truth. He was aware, doing this, that Elvien might not understand enough of his language to follow it. He was aware that he might be talking to himself. But he had learned, in 17 years of military service, that the way you talk to someone mattered independently of the words, and that honesty had a specific quality in the body, in posture and eye contact, in the pace of speech, that could cross significant language gaps if you meant it hard enough. He said, "I am going to try to get you out of here," he said. "There are people coming for you this afternoon who I believe will hurt you. Not out of malice, but out of the same logic that makes war make sense, and I don't want that to happen," he said. "I don't know what you are or where you come from, or why your ship went down here, or what you're doing on this planet at all. I know your people, and my people are at war. I know what your soldiers have done to my world, and I know what my people have done in return. And I know none of that is about either of us sitting in this room right now," he said. "You fixed the hydraulic leak on a Humvee. You fixed the fluorescent light. I don't know what else that thing can do, and right now I don't care. Right now I care that you're a kid with a broken leg, who's scared and who shouldn't have to disappear into a facility and never come back out." He said, "I need you to trust me for about 3 more hours, and I need you to show me that device." Elvien listened to all of this. The bioluminescence moved through several states. When Hadrian finished speaking, it was quiet for a long moment. Then it picked up the device and held it toward him. This time Hadrian didn't set it back down. He held it and felt the pulse change again and watched the light inside it forming shapes and thought very deliberately about specific things. The layout of the base, the eastern perimeter fence, the tree line, the road that ran northeast toward a small town called Milledgeville, where he knew there was a sympathizer network that had been quietly operating for 2 years, moving people and equipment in ways that the official command structure chose not to officially know about. He thought about these things as clearly and specifically as he could. The device in his hands was warm, and it pulsed, and the shapes inside it moved. Then Elvien took it back, looked at it, and looked at him. Made a sound that was quiet and direct. "Was that yes?" Hadrian said. The bioluminescence brightened across the cheekbones. "Okay," he said. "Let's go find Marine." The plan, such as it was not a good plan. Hadrian was professionally honest about this. He had made good plans and bad plans in the course of his career, and this one occupied a category he'd come to call adequate under constraints, which was another way of saying it would probably work until something went wrong, and then they would adapt, which was how all plans actually worked in the field anyway. Marine had done what he'd asked. The base's 2 off-duty vehicles, a civilian pickup that had been commandeered 18 months ago, and a battered utility van that technically belonged to the base quartermaster, but was generally regarded as communal property, were parked near the eastern maintenance shed, keys in the ignition, fuel tanks confirmed full as of 0800. Ortega had packed a field medical kit and added it to the pickup's cab without asking any questions, which was either professional instinct or willful complicity, and Hadrian had decided he didn't need to determine which. Vasquez had stopped writing his letter and was leaning against the maintenance shed wall smoking a cigarette, not looking at anything in particular, in the specific posture of a soldier who is performing the act of not being a lookout. At 11:45, Vance's team made a systematic sweep of the base perimeter. Hadrian watched this from the motor pool and felt the clock compress. They had known this was coming. The sweep meant Vance was getting impatient. The 1400 deadline had been a negotiating position, not a promise, and Hadrian had known that when he made it. "Time to go," he said to Marine. She had Elvien on one side, helping him manage the crutches on uneven ground. She nodded without speaking. They moved through the maintenance area, which ran along the eastern side of the base and was a useful maze of containers, equipment bays, and stored materials that provided excellent concealment from anyone doing a perimeter sweep from the west side. Hadrian went first, rifle up, checking corners by habit even though this was his base, and he knew every square foot of it. Knowing every square foot of it also meant knowing which corners had camera coverage and which didn't. He had made note of the gaps 11 months ago for precisely the kind of situation that had never arisen until today. They were 15 meters from the eastern fence, wire mesh, no current, clipped at the base in one spot that Marine had prepared earlier in the morning, when Vance's voice cut through the base PA. "Sergeant Hadrian, report to base command immediately. This is not a request." Hadrian didn't stop walking. "He knows," Marine said quietly. "He's guessing. Keep moving." 10 meters. The PA again. "All personnel be advised. A security situation is in progress. All non-essential personnel return to barracks. Stu personnel sweep grid Delta." 5 meters. Elvien on the crutches was moving faster than Hadrian had thought possible. The improvised splint and the lower gravity of ground-level movement had apparently combined to allow a pace that his broken leg assessment hadn't anticipated, or maybe it was adrenaline. That crossed species lines too. They hit the fence. The gap was there. Marine went first, then held it for Elvian. Then Hadrian came through and heard the first shout from somewhere behind him. Not a PA announcement, a human voice. The specific tone of someone who had just seen something and was calling it in. Truck, he said. The pickup was 50 meters into the pine trees, parked off a fire road that the base's official maps documented as impassable, which was accurate for heavy vehicles and inaccurate for a civilian truck driven by someone who knew the tree spacing. Marine had the engine running before Hadrian had the passenger door open. He lifted Elvian into the cab, one smooth movement, the child's hands gripping his shoulders, the device warm on its cord between them, and was in the seat and pulling the door as Marine hit the accelerator. The truck moved through the trees. Behind them, through the rear window, Hadrian could see the fence and the maintenance area, and the first shapes of Vance's team appearing at the gap, too far back to engage and clearly uncertain of the tree line. He watched them get smaller. He looked down. Elvian was sitting in the middle of the cab bench, crutches arranged awkwardly across its lap, device held in both hands. It was looking forward through the windshield at the morning light coming through the trees. Then it turned and looked at Hadrian. He expected some expression of relief, some equivalent of thank you. He had not quite expected what he actually got, which was a long, solemn, appraising look from those vertical pupilled eyes, followed by Elvian reaching out and placing one hand very precisely on the back of Hadrian's right hand where it rested on his knee. Just that. A hand on a hand. The weight of it approximately the weight of an old promise. Yeah, Hadrian said. Same. The sympathizer network in Milledgeville turned out to be 3 people in a hardware store, which was exactly the kind of operational security that worked precisely because it was too small and too obvious to bother surveilling. Their names were Lou, Petra, and a man who went by Decker and had declined to provide anything further, which Hadrian respected. They fed the 3 of them, Hadrian, Marine, Elvian, in a back room above the store, and they asked no questions about the blue-gray child eating peanut butter off a spoon and watching a transistor radio with complete absorption, and Hadrian was grateful for the professional courtesy. He slept for 2 hours on a cot while Marine kept watch. When he woke up, Elvian was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside him with the device in its lap, doing something he could not quite follow, making small adjustments to it, delicate movements of its fingers at the surface, the way a musician makes small corrections to an instrument's tuning. Hadrian lay still and watched. The device was doing something new. The interior light was not pulsing anymore, but running in a continuous stream, fast, complex, like a signal being transmitted or received. Elvian's expression was concentrated, internal, the same expression Vasquez had worn writing his letter. Are you talking to someone? Hadrian said. Elvian didn't look up immediately. Then it did, and the expression shifted to something careful and significant. It pointed upward. Hadrian sat up. Your people? Elvian made a sound that had a confirmatory tone. You're telling them where you are. A pause, then a nod. Human gesture, picked up and used deliberately. He thought about this for a moment. Then he said, Are they coming for you? Another nod. How long? Elvian held up 3 fingers. Then it did something Hadrian hadn't seen it do before. It gestured at the window, at the position of the light coming through it, tracking a small arc across the sky. 3 days keyed to the position of the sun. 3 days, he said. He sat with that. It had implications. It meant 3 more days in a situation that was already unsustainable. Vance would have the county locked down within hours. The Stew's reach extended further than their official mandate suggested. And 3 days in a hardware store above someone else's hidden network was 3 days of exposure for Lou, Petra, Decker, but also meant something else. It meant there was an endpoint. Elvian wasn't just a lost child. There were people coming. And if they arrived and found Elvian alive and cared for and intact, he was aware that he was doing a kind of calculation that felt dangerously like strategic optimism, which was another name for wishful thinking with better vocabulary. But he turned it over carefully and couldn't find the internal inconsistency. An HFY species that had been losing a war for 4 years had just spent 8 hours demonstrating unexpected kindness to a wounded alien child. That was data. That was the kind of data that changed equations, not because it was dramatic, but because it was specific and real and impossible to fake. He didn't say any of this to Elvian. He didn't need to. He just looked at the child and said, Then we've got 3 days. Tell me what you need. Elvian considered this seriously, in the way it considered everything. Then it held up the device and pointed at it with a questioning expression. Can I help with it? The bioluminescence brightened. Okay, Hadrian said. Show me. What followed was 3 days that Hadrian would spend the rest of his life finding imprecise words for. Vance's people came through Milledgeville twice. The first pass was systematic and professional, 4-vehicle convoy, standard street grid search, door to door in the commercial district. Lou stood in the doorway of the hardware store and answered questions in the specific way of someone who had lived in this town all their life and had no particular interest in anything unusual, and the search moved on. The second pass came 18 hours later, smaller 2 vehicles, and Hadrian watched it from the upstairs window and noted that Vance himself was in the lead vehicle, which meant the search had escalated to the point where he was running it personally. That was pressure, but it was also predictable pressure, and predictable pressure could be navigated. In the spaces between, Hadrian and Elvian worked. The device was not, as Hadrian had initially categorized it, simply a repair tool. It was a repair tool in the way that a multi-tool is a screwdriver. Technically accurate, fundamentally insufficient. What it was, as nearly as Hadrian could understand from 3 days of very patient cross-species nonverbal communication, was an interface. It read the structural state of physical systems, any physical systems, from the ballast of a fluorescent light to the hydraulic plumbing of a Humvee to, apparently, the specific electromagnetic signature of an injured Varese leg bone, and it diagnosed, and it corrected, towards some baseline of intended function that it held in whatever passed for its memory. It could also, Elvian demonstrated on the third morning, project, not a repair beam, something else, a field. It took Hadrian most of a day to understand what he was seeing, and then another several hours to understand what it meant, and then he sat in the back room of the hardware store in the late afternoon light and stared at the wall for a long time. The Varese spears coordinated via subsonic pulse. The Stu and the research teams had known this for 2 years and had built the Thornton barrier partly around it. Interrupt the pulse, disrupt the coordination. By window time, what nobody had understood because nobody had managed to get a cooperative Varese subject for long enough to ask was the architecture underneath. The subsonic pulse wasn't the signal, it was the carrier. What it carried was the same kind of field that the device projected, a structural diagnostic field, broad spectrum, continuous, that the spears used to maintain spatial awareness of each other and of the terrain around them. The Thornton barrier interrupted the carrier but left the field intact, which was why the disruption effect only lasted minutes. The spears recalibrated to each other's fields directly once the carrier was down. If you had a device that could interface with that field, if you could run that field in a configuration the spear's sensors expected, but that carried corrupted spatial data, he stopped himself. He was doing it again. The strategic optimism with better vocabulary. He looked at Elvian. That field you showed me, he said. The projection, can it be modified? Can you change what it tells things? Elvian watched him steadily. If I showed you what I needed it to do, Hadrian said, if I could describe the signal architecture we're trying to corrupt, could you? He stopped. Elvian had gone very still. It was looking at the device in its hands with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not the fear stillness, not the grief stillness, but something more complex than either. Something that was working through a problem that had more dimensions than he could see from where he was. Standing. You don't have to, Hadrian said. I'm not asking you to. That's not why I helped you. Elvian looked up. I helped you because you were a kid with a broken leg in a crashed ship, Hadrian said. That's the whole reason. There isn't a strategic one. The bioluminescence moved in a long, slow wave across Elvian's face and neck and the backs of its hands. It was, Hadrian had come to understand, the equivalent of a very long, very serious look. The kind of look that isn't processing new information, but is rather confirming something it had already begun to believe. Then Elvian put the device on the floor between them and spoke. The words were Varese, and Hadrian could not understand them. But he had been in the room with this child for 3 days, and he had learned its tonal architecture the way you learn the weather patterns of a place you've come to call home, and he understood the structure of what was being said even without the content. There was a statement of condition, there was a statement of decision, there was a very specific cadence at the end that was neither question nor instruction, but something between them, the sound of a thing being chosen. Elvian picked up the device. It looked at Hadrian. It nodded once. In the deliberate way it used gestures it had learned from him, gestures it had taken and made precise. You sure? Hadrian said. The bioluminescence across the cheekbones. Bright and steady. They worked through the night. Maureen, who had electronics training from before the war, when she'd been studying for an engineering degree that the invasion had interrupted, served as the translator between Hadrian's tactical knowledge of Thornton barrier architecture and Elvian's operational understanding of the device. She drew diagrams. Elvian looked at them and corrected them with small, precise adjustments, using a pencil that it had picked up and learned to use with complete competence inside of 20 minutes, which said something about Varese fine motor development that Hadrian would have found fascinating under different circumstances. Lou brought food at midnight. Petra sat in the corner and ran the radio scanner, tracking stew patrol frequencies. Decker had vanished earlier in the day with a vague indication that he was attending to logistics and had returned at 2200 with a set of electronic components that Hadrian had described as necessary and had not expected to be obtainable, and which Decker had provided with no explanation, which meant either that he had a very well-stocked back room or connections that Hadrian had underestimated, and either way Hadrian was grateful. By 0300 they hazarded something. It was not the thing Hadrian had imagined when he'd first started the calculation. It was smaller, more specific, harder to describe. It was a module, a physical module, built around Elvian's guidance, that could interface with a standard Thornton barrier emitter and extend its disruption effect from approximately 4 minutes to something in the range of 40, not by blocking the Varese coordination carrier more effectively, but by injecting a field that corrupted the structural spatial data underneath and keeping that corruption running for as long as the module had power. 40 minutes of disorganized spear fire. 40 minutes in which a Varese ground assault would be operating blind. He looked at the module sitting on the workbench. Then he looked at Elvian. "This is enough to change a battle," he said. Elvian looked at it too. Its expression was careful and complicated and honest. "I know it doesn't fix everything," Hadrian said. "I know you didn't come here to do this. I know." He stopped. He was aware that he didn't know what Elvian had come here to do, or why the ship had been in this sector, or what the broader picture was that contained both their species' 4-year war and this specific wreck in a Georgia pine forest. "I know it's not simple," he finished. "I know it cost you something." Elvian looked at the module. Then it looked at Hadrian, and it made the sound he'd first heard in the crashed ship, the one that had needed no translation. A long, low, resolved note, something between a sigh and a statement. The sound of something that has been considered and arrived at and accepted. Then it reached out and set one hand on top of Hadrian's. The weight of it again like a promise. "Thank you," Hadrian said. The pickup came for Elvian on the 3rd afternoon, and it was not what Hadrian had expected. He had expected a ship. He had built, in the back of his mind, a version of this ending that involved something coming down through the clouds. A Varese vessel, frightening and magnificent, coming to collect its child. That was the version his imagination had offered him. What actually happened was quieter and stranger. The device had been signaling for 3 days. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, it changed its signal. Elvian felt the change before any of them could detect it, pulling the device from its cord with sudden alert attention and holding it up to look at it. The interior light was different. Not the pulse, not the transmission stream, but a steady warm glow that Hadrian had not seen before. Elvian looked at him. It pointed upward, then lowered its hand slowly toward the floor in a descending arc, coming down. "They're landing," he said. Elvian shook its head. It made the arc again, smaller this time, and pointed toward the road. "Driving?" He paused. "They're already here? They've been here?" The bioluminescence pulsed bright. "On the ground," Hadrian said slowly. "They've had people on the ground." He looked at Marine. She looked back with the expression of someone revising her model of the situation. 20 minutes later, there was a knock at the hardware store door. Lou answered it. There was a brief exchange that Hadrian could not hear from upstairs. Then Lou came up and stood in the doorway with an expression that was carefully and professionally blank. "There's a man," Lou said. "Who would like to speak to whoever's in charge here?" The man turned out not to be human, not exactly. Though in a dim-lit doorway at a glance he would have passed for it, which was presumably the point. He was tall, blue-gray in the way that Elvian was blue-gray, with a stillness in the way he held himself that read as age and authority. He wore clothes that were generically civilian, jeans, a jacket, boots, with the slight wrongness of someone wearing a costume rather than a wardrobe. He looked at Elvian first. The sound that Elvian made, seeing him, was not one Hadrian had a category for. It was short and involuntary, and it broke across several registers at once. The bioluminescence flooded fully bright, cheeks and forehead and the backs of its hands all alight, and it crossed the room on the crutches in 4 fast, ungraceful steps and buried its face against the tall Varese's side. The tall Varese held it, put one hand on the back of its head, said something very quiet. Then he looked at Hadrian. His eyes were not vertical pupilled. They were close enough to human standard that Hadrian couldn't determine the difference in the lamplight. His expression was not military or tactical or assessing. It was the expression of a parent who has just gotten a child back. "You kept him safe?" he said. His English was accented but precise, the accent of someone who had learned the language from recordings or text rather than from speaking with native speakers. "We tried," Hadrian said. "You did more than try." The tall Varesi looked at the module on the workbench. He was quiet for a moment. "He told us what you built." Hadrian said nothing. "We know what that is," the tall Varesi said. "What it will do to our spears in the field." "Yes," Hadrian said. "He chose to help you make it. He chose. Not me," I asked, "and he chose, and I would have respected either answer." The tall Varesi looked at him for a long time. The same kind of long, slow look that Elvian had. The one that wasn't processing information but was measuring something else. "Why?" he said finally. Hadrian thought about it. He thought about the order of words, materials, survivors, assets, and about a facility outside Colorado Springs in a very particular kind of silence, and about a transistor radio playing something orchestral in a small room in the early morning. He thought about the way Elvian had listened to the music with its entire body and then tried, in its own biology, to answer it. He thought about Vasquez writing a letter by hand. Because he was a kid, Hadrian said. That's all. He was a kid, and he was scared, and he was hurt, and that's the whole reason. The tall Varesi looked at Elvian. Elvian was watching Hadrian with the bright, steady bioluminescence, and on its face was an expression that Hadrian had learned over 3 days to read with some accuracy. The tall Varesi said something in Varesi to Elvian. Elvian answered. The exchange was brief. Then the tall Varesi looked back at Hadrian. "He says you showed him music," he said. "Yeah, he says your people make sounds to feel things out loud." Hadrian paused. He understood that? He understood it immediately. Something shifted in the tall Varesi's expression. "We do not have music. We have never had music. We had not considered that a civilization capable of war was also capable of that." The room was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a truck went past on the road. The scanner in Petra's corner hissed gently. "We are not only what we do when we fight," Hadrian said. "Neither are we," said the tall Varesi. They left before dawn. Hadrian stood outside the hardware store in the gray pre-light and watched. There was no ship. There was a convoy of civilian vehicles that proceeded north on a county road and disappeared between the pine trees, and if the occupants of those vehicles were not entirely what they appeared to be, no satellite would have been able to confirm that from anything above the cloud deck. Elvian, before getting into the lead vehicle, had stopped and turned back. It stood on the crutches in the early dark and looked at Hadrian. The bioluminescence was doing the complex ripple pattern he'd learned to associate with strong emotion, obsessed rather than expressed. It held the device in both hands. For a moment, he thought it was going to give it to him, and he had already formed the beginning of a refusal in his mind. "No, that's yours. That was never the point," when Elvian did something different. It held the device out, pulsed it once deliberately, in a specific pattern he hadn't seen before. Then it held out one hand, palm up, in a human gesture. He looked at the device. It was still pulsing, but differently now. A pattern he couldn't read, steady and complex. "What did you do?" he said. Elvian pointed at the device. Then it touched its own chest where the cord usually rested. Then it pointed at Hadrian's chest. "You left something in it," Hadrian said. "The bioluminescence. The slow, warm pulse. Is it? Can other people use it? Can our people?" Elvian held up its hands in that equalizing gesture, both palms level. Patient. Hadrian thought about this. Then he thought about the module on the workbench, and about Vance's convoy moving through Milledgeville, and about 60% attrition over 4 years, and about what 40 minutes of uncorrupted position data might mean in a sustained engagement. He thought about music. "Okay," he said. Elvian nodded. Then it turned and got into the vehicle, and the convoy moved. Marine came to stand beside him as the last vehicle's lights disappeared. "What do we do now?" she said. Hadrian looked at the device in his hands. It was warm. It pulsed every few seconds in the pattern Elvian had left in it, steady and alive. "We go back," he said. "Back to base. We walk in through the front gate." He turned the device over in his hands. "And we show Vance what we've got." Marine was quiet for a moment. "That's not going to go the way you think it will." "No," he agreed. "It's going to go the way it goes, which is different from the way Vance thinks it will go, and that's what matters." She considered this. "What's in that thing now?" "I don't know exactly." He turned it again. The light inside moved. "I think it's a key, or a map, or both. Something Elvian wanted us to have that his people agreed we should have." He paused. "Something he decided we'd earned." She was quiet again. Then, "What did we do to earn it?" He thought about that for a long time. He thought about what they had not done. He thought about a child with a broken leg and a cup of water and a transistor radio and a triangle of processed cheese held up against the light with skeptical eyes. He thought about Ortega making crutches without asking questions, and Vasquez writing a letter and Tanaka staring at a hydraulic system that had just stopped leaking. He thought about the weight of a small hand on the back of his. He started. Then he stopped, because the words were imprecise. Then he tried again. We just treated him like he mattered, he said. That's all. Marin thought about this. Then she said that shouldn't be remarkable. No, Hadrian said. It shouldn't. He looked up. The sky was getting pale in the east. That particular gray before the gold, the kind of light that made every object in the world look new-made and temporary and precise. Somewhere above the cloud deck, maybe, a fleet was sitting in orbit. 17 warships, or fewer than 17 now. The war had taken its toll on both sides. He knew that, even if the toll was distributed differently than he'd imagined. Sitting up there, doing whatever the Varese strategic calculus required of them, working toward an end that he still didn't fully understand. Below that, down here in the clay and the pines and the pre-dawn light, a hardware store was waking up. A convoy was moving north on a county road. In a forward operating base, somewhere southwest of what used to be Savannah, a fluorescent light was burning clean and steady in a duty room, and a Humvee in the motor pool had no hydraulic leak, and a man named Vasquez was probably waking up and continuing a letter that would reach someone who needed to hear it. Hadrian put the device on its cord around his neck. It was warm against his chest. It pulsed its slow, regular beat, steady as a second heart. Come on, he said. Long drive back. They walked into Phobe Calder at 1400 that afternoon. Through the front gate, past the sentries who saw them coming and had a specific variety of expression, not hostile, more like the expression of people watching something that makes no tactical sense and waiting to see if it resolves, and across the yard to the command building where Vance was waiting. He had 4 of his people with him. He looked at Hadrian with those pale, systematic eyes and said nothing for a moment, taking in the state of things. Hadrian, Marine, no Elvian. Hadrian with something on a cord around his neck. Where is it, he said. Gone, Hadrian said. Gone. His people picked him up. 3 days ago, they were already on the ground. I don't know how long they've been running an embedded network. He paused. That's information you'll want to work with. Vance's jaw tightened. You let it go. I helped a kid get home, Hadrian said. That's what happened. You have any idea what he gave us this. Hadrian took the device off the cord and held it out on his palm. Before he left, he gave it to us, to humanity. Not to you specifically, not to the stew, to us. He looked at Vance steadily. He made that choice. Not under interrogation, not under restraint, not because someone held him in a facility and took things apart until they found the useful pieces. He chose. Vance looked at the device. Something moved in his expression. He was a smart man. Hadrian had never thought otherwise. He was a man with a complete moral framework, and the framework was built on the premise that the right way to get useful things from the enemy was to take them. He was looking at the result of a different premise. What does it do? He said. A lot of things, Hadrian said. We'll show you. He extended the device. Vance took it. It sat in his hand, and Hadrian watched its pulse slow slightly, but hold, still warm, still pulsing, still working. There's more, Hadrian said, but you need to understand that it was given, not taken. The way you use it matters. Vance was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the device, then he looked at Hadrian. You're telling me how to do my job, he said. I'm telling you how this works, Hadrian said. The thing is, Captain, I think he knew what it would be used for. He understood enough by the end. He's not stupid. His people are not stupid. They made a calculation. He paused. I'd like to think it was about more than just the device. Vance looked at him. The pale, systematic eyes moved through something complex. What do you mean? Hadrian thought about a transistor radio in a duty room and a small hand on the back of his, and a bioluminescent child holding a triangle of processed cheese up to the light. I think, he said carefully, that they wanted to know what we do when we think no one is watching, when there's no strategic benefit, when it's just us and someone who needs help, and the choice of what to do about it. He looked at the device in Vance's hand. I think that thing is partly what it does, and partly a message about what it was decided we deserved. Vance said nothing. 4 years of war, Hadrian said. They've had 17 ships in orbit the entire time, and they haven't ended it. There's a reason for that. I don't know what it is, but I know there's one. He looked at the device. Maybe we just found out part of it. The yard was very quiet. The generators hummed. The motor pool was still. The angle grinder had not started up yet today. Marine was standing 3 feet behind Hadrian, and he could feel her stillness. The kind of stillness that is not passive, but is waiting, wound, ready for whatever came next. Nothing dramatic came next. Vance looked at the device for a long time. Then he closed his hand around it, and the pulse continued steady and warm, patient as breath against his palm. Show me what it does, he said. 3 weeks later, in a contested sector in what used to be the Appalachian Corridor, a Varesi spear assault rolled into a valley and encountered a Thornton barrier, emitter equipped with a modified module. The emitter had been built by a team that included a corporal with an interrupted engineering degree, a medic who refused to let equipment die, and a master sergeant who had driven a civilian pickup truck through a Georgia pine forest at dawn. The spears entered the field. The field carried corrupted spatial data, the structural diagnostic signal they used to maintain position awareness of each other and the terrain, quietly and precisely wrong in 47 specific parameters, none of them individually detectable, all of them together producing a coherent but inaccurate picture of where everything was. The assault stalled. Not because the spears panicked, they didn't panic. Spears didn't appear to have a mechanism for panic, but because they were moving through a space that their senses told them was a different space, and the mismatch between expectation and reality compounded with each passing second. The 40 minutes of disruption time was used in full. The valley held. It was not the end of the war. Hadrian had never thought it would be. It was a valley and 40 minutes, and a change equation in one specific sector, and the equation would be applied again and again in different configurations as the module's design spread through channels that Hadrian had ensured were broad rather than controlled, distributed to units rather than consolidated in facilities. Not because he was naive about what Vance's people might do with it, but because broad distribution was harder to monopolize and the thing in the device was not a weapon, exactly. It was a conversation, started by a child who had listened to a transistor radio in a duty room with his whole body and decided that the people who made that sound might be worth something. Hadrian carried the device for a long time after Elvian left it with him. He wore it on the cord under his uniform against his chest. The pulse was always there, warm, steady, patient, every 4 or 5 seconds, like the pendulum of some very old clock measuring time, in a way that had nothing to do with urgency. He thought about what the tall Varesi had said. We had not considered that a civilization capable of war was also capable of that. He thought about what he had said in return. We are not only what we do when we fight. He thought about Elvian at the radio, the complex bioluminescent patterns cascading across its face as it listened, as it tried in its own biology to do what the orchestra was doing, to take feeling and make it audible, to say something wordless and true in the direction of something else that was listening. He thought about what it meant that a species 4 years into a war with humanity, with 17 warships in orbit and demonstrated capacity to end it, had a child somewhere in the command hierarchy, or in the diplomatic hierarchy, or in whatever the Varesi equivalent of those things was, who had reached out across the species gap and chosen to trust, and had been right. He did not think of this as victory. He thought of it as a beginning, the specific, fragile, load-bearing kind of beginning that everything eventual is made of. The kind that starts not with a treaty or a battle won, but with a hand on a hand, in a truck cab moving through pine trees at dawn, the world outside going gray to gold, the road ahead unmapped. He had been in the field long enough to know that the unmapped road was not a problem. It was the only kind worth traveling. On the day he finally handed the device over, not to Vance, but to the joint research team that had been established under a new framework, the one with oversight and distributed authority, and a specific structural requirement that any Varesi-derived technology be used in a way that could be documented and defended. He held it one more time before setting it at the table. It was warm. It pulsed at slow rhythm. The inside of it, in that last moment before he let it go, was doing the thing it had done on the first night, in the crash site, in the pre-dawn dark, forming shapes, dissolving them, reforming, a thought process being observed, or something like a thought process, or something that didn't have a precise word in any language he spoke, a thing that existed in the space between question and answer, between knowing and not yet knowing, in the interval where understanding begins. He set it down. It kept pulsing. He walked out into the Georgia morning, and the light was doing what light does when the season has turned, and the air has that particular cleanness that follows rain, and somewhere in the pine trees to the east, a bird was making a sound that was organized and specific, and carried no information, except feeling, except the pure insistent fact of being alive and being heard. He listened to it for a moment, then he went to work.